When Matt Ridley first heard the theory that COVID was actually cooked up in a Chinese laboratory, he dismissed it as being a conspiracy theory on the lines of UFO landings and Elvis still being alive. But after a year looking into it, he thinks there's a lot more to this theory, perhaps why Joe Biden has now instructed the American intelligence services to reopen their investigation into what previously had seemed to be a Donald Trump conspiracy madness. He joins me now. Matt, thanks very much for your cover piece. Why did you start looking into this? Because for a long time, nobody sensible thought this made sense.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, I started out from the assumption that Mother Nature's a better genetic engineer than we are, and so it would be hard. We'd be hard put in a lab to come up with something this infectious, this efficient, this lethal. And then, as I began to look into it, I started interviewing scientists for an article in the Wall Street Journal about the origin of the virus and the bats and the pangolins and all that kind of stuff as it was emerging in the spring of 2020. And I could, it was clear that it didn't quite add up, and some of them was saying, well, don't worry, it will add up. But the market theory began to collapse, and then in May 2020, two things happened. One, a paper came out from a scientist named Alina Chan and her colleagues in Boston, saying this virus was very well adapted to human cells from the very beginning. That's unlike SARS, which took months to evolve rapidly to become a good at infecting people. And the other thing that happened that same week was the head of the Chinese CDC said, we've tested all the animals in the market and they're all negative. Now, that was very quietly announced. They didn't want that news to be a big splash. But you put those two together and you say, well, hang on, if it didn't come out the market and it was well adapted to human beings from the start, maybe it's been playing around in human cells in the lab. And then one started looking into the labs in Wuhan and what they were doing and finding that actually, of all the cities in the world, this is the one that has been studying bat coronaviruses more than any other laboratory on the entire planet. And it has been collecting thousands of samples, and the nearest relative, which was collected by the scientists from this lab, was collected from more than 1,200 miles away by road during one of 7 collecting trips to one particular mine shaft, and that in the months afterwards, more and more attempts were made to find closely related viruses, and none have been as close as that one collected by the scientists and brought to the laboratory. So for me, it was very much a journey of discovery.
But why would a lab in Wuhan be cultivating a virus for, you say it was very well prepared to jump into human. Why would somebody do that? Are we talking, because one of the conspiracy theories is that China, I suppose like Russia, North Korea, is developing biological weapons, the kind of virus that you might use to defeat your enemies. Is that what we're talking about here? Because what purpose would they have really to be cultivating a virus that could kill millions of people?
Well, it's possible that there was a secret bioweapons program. We don't know for sure that there wasn't, but it's pretty unlikely. This wouldn't make a good weapon. And besides, more importantly, there is a very open and obvious reason why they were doing it. And they weren't at all secret about it. And that is, in the wake of the SARS epidemic, there was a view that if scientists went out and sampled viruses in the wild, they might be able to avert the next pandemic. They might be able to identify potentially emergent pathogens that were likely to cause major epidemics. And they also wanted to track down the origin of SARS. This started with tracking down the original source of SARS. And in that, they largely succeeded. They found a cave in Yunnan where basically all the ingredients of the SARS virus were present in some horseshoe bats. And they reckoned that they'd solved it. But they continued to do this work because they wanted to be able to say, look, we've spotted the next virus that is likely to cause a pandemic. We've found it. We've understood it. We've even perhaps developed a vaccine against it. That was an explicit aim also. And a lot of this money was supported by American taxpayer funding. The USAID, the American Aid Program, spent a fortune on what it called the Emerging Pandemics Threats Program, which particularly had a strand to it called PREDICT, which was about exactly this. And a lot of that money found its way to this Chinese team in collaboration with an American foundation called the EcoHealth Alliance, which was at its peak a couple of years ago, spending £17 million dollars of taxpayers' money per year on sampling viruses in the wild, bringing them into the laboratory, doing experiments with them, and trying to find out if you could make them more infectious to human cells by mixing and matching different parts of their genomes.
Why would you try to see if it would be more infectious? What's the rationale behind that?
Well, the rationale was, if you take a bat virus into the lab and you manage to isolate a live virus, it doesn't like infecting human cells, so you can't work on it, you can't do experiments with it. So if you swap its spike gene into another genome of another virus, then you can tell how dangerous that spike is on its own. That's the logic. It's not terribly good logic, we now know, because the risk is you're going to produce a chimera virus that is more dangerous. And one of the things they then did was infect humanized mice. These are mice that have been genetically engineered so that instead of the mouse ACE2 receptor, they've got the human ACE2 receptor. And this is to be able to say, how dangerous is this virus to humans? We're going to try it in these mice, which are basically like little humans. Given how infectious this virus was, if they were doing it with this virus, then it's extremely likely that one of the scientists or lab technicians would have picked up an infection.
Right, but surely if you're doing research into that, you would take all sorts of precautions. If the American government itself is sending millions of American taxpayer dollars onto this, they will be pretty sure that these will be done in a controlled way. I mean, nuclear energy is very dangerous, but all precautions are made to make sure it doesn't seep out. Surely the Chinese would have that covered. The idea that you might just wander home with a new pathogen capable of killing millions, I mean, surely precautions would have been taken, and the American authorities would have to be confident that those precautions were being taken. Otherwise, they wouldn't fund the program in the first place.
Well, very interestingly, in 2018, the American embassy in Beijing sent a delegation to Wuhan to look at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, specifically to look at its biosecurity level 4 lab, which is the highest biosecurity level. That's the one which you do Ebola research in. Funnily enough, SARS does not require BSL-4, it requires BSL-3. And they made several suggestions about how this wasn't being, the safety and security procedures were not good enough and ought to be improved. This was China's only and first biosecurity level 4 lab was in Wuhan at this institute. Now, as I say, they were doing experiments in BSL-3 on SARS itself, but the bat viruses, the ones they were collecting in the wild from bats, which were not very good at infecting people, most of them, they were doing that at biosecurity level 2. And that was what the international rules said, by the way. Now, in BSL-4, you're in a spacesuit, you're breathing through an air tube, there's positive pressure in your suit so that you can't, if you puncture it, nothing comes in. BSL-3, it's not quite like that. You are at least breathing the air, but you are totally enclosed in a suit and you're working within a sealed cabinet, which is negative pressure. BSL-2, you're just wearing goggles, a mask and a lab coat. That's it. Nothing else.
Right, so this sounds like you paint a picture, I guess a plausible picture, of a sort of Chernobyl-style disaster, and the history of everything from the Titanic sinking onwards. You've the best laid security plans of mice, men, and nuclear scientists go aft agley. But surely what you're missing, Rhea, right now it still is just that. It's a theory. All you're saying effectively is it could have come from a lab, sure. Nobody denies that. But whether it did come from a lab, the best evidence you've got is that we have not yet identified the missing link that we found with SARS-1. In other words, they managed to get to the original Batcave. They managed to connect the dots between animals and human the first time around. Nobody's managed to connect the dots between animals and humans this time around. And that you're saying, well, what about a lab leak? Sure, it's plausible, but it's not conclusive. The Chinese government still describe this as absolutely crazy to fan up racial discrimination and xenophobia. When this was mentioned back in April, the Washington Post described it as a conspiracy theory. The New York Times said it was a fringe theory. The Lancet has already published a statement by several scientists condemning conspiracy theories suggesting COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. So surely a great many people, including very esteemed scientists, have dismissed this theory as bunkum.
Well, that is changing. A year ago, a great many scientists, as you say, signed up to this view that it was a conspiracy theory and a fringe idea. And the problem was Donald Trump was in favour of this idea, and that made it automatically anathema to a lot of people. But they confused two things. One was the deliberate bioweapon synthetic virus idea, and the other was handling viruses in the laboratory in an accident. And frankly, the latter has always been much more plausible. You're seeing a lot of scientists now climbing back off over the fence to say, actually, we realise that this is possible. One of the signatories of that letter in the Lancet that you mentioned has said, actually, I think it needs to be investigated. One of the authors of a key paper called The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2, which was a very influential paper in March last year, has now said he thinks it deserves to be investigated. So more and more scientists have now changed their view and said, yes, it does need to be investigated. But you are right that we have no direct proof of a lab leak. There's no record of an incident. And more importantly, there's no record of this particular virus being experimented on. Now, you might, the Wuhan Institute of Virology says, look, if we'd had this virus in the lab, we'd have published it. Well, would you? In February last year, they published the virus, the genome of the virus that was closest related to this, and they'd had that since 2013. So they don't publish things immediately. They had a database with 22,000 entries in it, 15,000 of which were about bat viruses. They were both data on where it was collected, but also genome sequences and partial genome sequences. Now that database, 22,000 items, went offline on the 12th of September 2019, before the pandemic began. And they've come up with all sorts of excuses why they won't share now what was in it. They say, well, there are hacking attempts to it. Well, all the more reason to show legitimate inquiries what's in that database. Also, when they published that related virus, that's the closest relative of SARS-CoV-2, in February last year, they disguised its origin, changed its name, did not mention the fact that 3 people had died in the mine shaft where it was collected, and didn't say that they'd found 8 other similar viruses at the same time. Now, that is not the behaviour of a group that thinks it's innocent. Now, it says it's innocent, and the Chinese government says it couldn't have come out of the lab. But in that case, be transparent. Open your books. Show us what you've got. And we will no doubt be utterly convinced.
Well, that question of innocence, and I guess the question of who done it, is the cover of this week's Spectator. Matt Ridley's article is there. Matt, thanks very much for joining us on Spectator TV.